The shadow in the basement. Last summer my cousin invited me to stay at his house for a few days. One night the power went out because of a storm. We decided to get some candles from the basement. As we opened the basement door, a cold breeze hit us. We went down with flashlights, but my cousin suddenly froze and pointed towards the corner. There was a shadow standing perfectly still. It was not moving and it wasn't ours. We whispered hello, but there was no response. Suddenly the shadow moved and disappeared behind some shelves. We ran upstairs and locked the door. When the power came back we checked but found nothing. But the strange part was there were wet footprints on the basement floor. Neither of us had been wet. The window knocker. One hot summer night I was home alone because my parents were out of town. I had my window open because of the heat. Around 2 a.m. I heard soft tapping on the glass. I thought maybe it was bugs, but the tapping became rhythmic. Like a knock knock pause knock. I pulled the curtain slightly and saw a figure standing outside. It was a man wearing a hoodie. He was smiling and pointing at the lock on my window. I quickly turned off my lights and hid. The knocking continued for several minutes. When I finally had the courage to look again, he was gone. But on the glass were smeared handprints like someone had been pressing their face against it. I still don't know how he got into the backyard because it was fenced all around. The late night passenger. I used to drive for a rideshare app during summer breaks. One night I got a request to pick someone up from a very remote area outside town. It was almost midnight, but I accepted. When I arrived there was no one at the pickup point. Just trees and a dirt road. As I was about to cancel the ride, a woman appeared out of the darkness and got into the back seat. She didn't speak. She just nodded when I asked her destination. As I started driving she whispered take me home but didn't give an address. I asked again but she stayed silent. When I turned to look back she was gone. The seat was empty. I stopped the car in shock. Later I found out there had been a fatal accident on that road years ago involving a woman who was never found. I never drove in that area again after that night. The silent caller. Last summer I was babysitting for a family friend. The house was big and old, but I wasn't too worried. Around 11 p.m. the landline phone rang. When I picked up there was complete silence. I said hello several times but no one answered. Then I heard soft breathing. It was very slow and deep. I hung up thinking it was a prank. But the phone rang again. This time the breathing turned into a low whisper. The voice said, "Do you see me?" I looked around but there was no one. I immediately locked all the doors and windows. The phone didn't ring again that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me from inside the house. The empty tent. 2 friends and I went camping near a lake last summer. We were the only ones at the campsite. Late at night we saw a light flickering in the woods. We decided to check it out, thinking maybe someone else had arrived. As we got closer we found a small tent with a lantern hanging outside. We called out but no one responded. Curious, we unzipped the tent but it was completely empty. No bags, no sleeping bags, nothing. Suddenly we heard footsteps circling us. The lantern's light started swinging violently as if someone had grabbed it. We ran back to our campsite and didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up the tent and lantern were both gone. Like they were never there. The basement reflection. One hot summer evening I was doing laundry in our basement. There is a small old mirror hanging on the wall near the washer. As I loaded clothes I glanced at the mirror and noticed a figure standing behind me. It was a woman with long black hair wearing a white dress. I spun around but no one was there. I looked back at the mirror and she was still there staring at me. Frozen in fear I backed away slowly and ran upstairs. Later when I told my grandmother she said a woman had died in that basement decades ago. She never told me how she died. But I never went into that basement alone again. The man who knocked thrice. It was a humid summer night in July. I was staying at my grandmother's old farmhouse for a week. The house was isolated with no neighbors nearby. That night I was in bed scrolling on my phone when I heard 3 loud knocks on the front door. It was past midnight and we were not expecting anyone. I peeked through the upstairs window but couldn't see anyone at the door. After a minute the knocking came again, this time louder and more aggressive. I woke up my grandmother and she said do not open the door no matter what. She seemed terrified but wouldn't explain why. The knocking stopped after a while but then it started on the back door. I checked through the kitchen window but saw no one. Suddenly we heard heavy footsteps moving around the house circling us. Grandmother began reciting verses under her breath. At exactly 3 a.m. everything went silent. She later told me an old tale about a spirit that knocks 3 times seeking permission to enter. She said it visits the farmhouse once every few years looking for someone who opens the door. That night I did not sleep at all. I still wonder what would have happened if I had answered the knock. The woman under the bridge. Last summer my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned railway bridge outside town. The locals had always said the bridge was haunted by the spirit of a woman who had jumped off it years ago. We didn't believe the stories and went there at midnight. As we walked across the creaky wooden planks we heard a soft sobbing sound. It was coming from beneath the bridge. We leaned over the edge but saw only darkness. Suddenly one of my friends screamed. He said he saw a pale face staring up from the water. We all froze. The sobbing turned into loud cries. It echoed all around us as if we were surrounded. We ran back to the car, but as we drove away we saw a woman standing under the bridge waving at us slowly. She had long wet hair and her dress was torn. No one said a word the entire drive home. I still get chills remembering her eyes locked onto us as we left. The Night Watcher. I used to work as a security guard for a large warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a lonely job, especially during the summer nights. One night while doing my routine patrol I noticed one of the motion sensors near the storage units had been triggered. I checked the cameras but saw nothing unusual. Still I decided to investigate. As I approached the storage units I felt an intense cold in the air. It was strange because it was a very hot night. Suddenly I heard a loud metallic clang as if someone had slammed a storage unit door. I drew my flashlight but saw no one. Then I noticed a shadow moving quickly across the far wall. It was not shaped like a person, it was tall and thin, almost distorted. I called out but received no response. For the next hour the shadow kept appearing in different parts of the warehouse, always staying just out of the camera's view. When my shift ended I reviewed the security footage. Every time I had seen the shadow the cameras showed nothing. But the motion sensors clearly detected movement. I quit that job the following week. I never found out who or what was watching me in that warehouse. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Last summer I was driving back home after visiting a friend. It was around 2 a.m. and the roads were empty. About 10 miles from my house I saw a woman standing by the side of the road. She was wearing a white dress and was waving for help. I slowed down and rolled down my window to ask if she was okay. She said she needed a ride to town. Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper. I told her to get in and she quietly sat in the back seat. As I started driving she kept looking out the window, not saying a word. When I looked in the rearview mirror I noticed something strange. Her reflection was not visible. I turned around quickly but the back seat was empty. I slammed the brakes and stopped the car. There was no sign of her anywhere on the road. The next day I told my friend about it. He said there have been stories of a woman who died in a car accident on that road years ago. People claim she appears to lonely drivers late at night asking for a ride. She never reaches her destination. The Silent Roommate. During my college summer break I rented a small apartment with a roommate. He was a quiet guy, always kept to himself. One night while I was studying late I noticed his bedroom door slightly open. Inside it was pitch dark. I called out to him but there was no response. Suddenly I saw a shadow move behind the door. Thinking it was a prank I walked over and pushed the door open. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. It was like no one had ever lived there. Confused I called the landlord who told me that apartment had been rented to a single person. I had never had a roommate. For weeks I had been sharing the apartment with someone who didn't exist. That night I packed my things and left. To this day I don't know who or what I had been living with. The knock from the attic. When I was 12 my family moved into an old house that had a small attic. It was the beginning of summer and my parents were busy unpacking. The first night I heard faint knocking sounds coming from the ceiling. At first I thought it was just the house settling. But the knocking became more frequent and rhythmic. It sounded like someone tapping from inside the attic. One afternoon I gathered enough courage to open the attic hatch. The air was cold and musty. As I climbed up with a flashlight I noticed small handprints on the wooden beams. They were too small to be an adult's and they seemed fresh. Suddenly I felt a tap on my shoulder but when I turned around no one was there. I stumbled back down and told my parents but they didn't believe me. For the rest of the summer the knocking continued every night. Eventually my father nailed the attic shut. But sometimes when the house is quiet I can still hear the soft tapping above my room. I don't think it ever left. The farmhouse visitor. Last summer, I was visiting my uncle's farmhouse, which was located far away from the city. The area was surrounded by dense fields and no neighbors for miles. One night, while everyone was asleep, I was sitting on the porch enjoying the cool breeze. Suddenly, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the field. At first I thought it was my uncle, but as I called out, the figure did not move. It just stood there watching the house. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it towards the field, but the figure vanished. I went inside and locked all the doors. Later that night, I heard soft knocking on the back door. When I peeked through the window, there was no one but muddy footprints leading away from the door towards the field. The next morning, my uncle said strange visitors had been seen around the farmhouse every summer. He never explained who or what they were. The reflection in the window. I used to stay up late during summer nights playing video games in my room. My desk faced a large window that looked into our backyard. One night around 2 a.m. I noticed movement in the window. At first I thought it was my own reflection, but then I realized the figure was not mimicking my movements. It was a dark silhouette standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the window, the figure was still there staring at me. Suddenly it smiled a wide, unnatural grin. I turned off my monitor and ran out of the room. My parents checked the backyard but found nothing. For weeks I avoided looking into that window at night. Even now I sometimes feel like something is watching me from the dark reflection. The whisper from the closet. During a summer sleepover at a friend's house, we decided to watch horror movies late into the night. His room had a large walk-in closet, which always gave me an uneasy feeling. Around 3 a.m. as we were about to fall asleep, we heard a faint whisper coming from the closet. It was so soft we could barely understand, but it sounded like it was calling my friend's name. We both sat up and listened. The whisper repeated his name over and over. We were frozen in fear. Suddenly the closet door creaked open slightly. My friend mustered up the courage to throw a shoe towards the door. Immediately the whispering stopped and the room went silent. We turned on all the lights, but there was no one inside the closet. His parents never believed us. But after that night we always kept the closet door tightly shut whenever I visited. Neither of us ever spoke about that whisper again. The cabin in the valley. Last summer my family rented a small cabin in a remote valley for a weekend getaway. The cabin was old but charming, with large windows that overlooked the forest. The first night everything was peaceful until around 2 a.m. when we heard faint footsteps on the wooden porch. We thought maybe it was an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and deliberate. When we peeked outside there was no one. But the next morning we found muddy footprints all around the cabin. That night the footsteps returned, but this time we also heard soft humming. It was a low, tuneless melody that sent chills down my spine. My father grabbed a flashlight and went outside but saw nothing. The humming stopped as soon as he stepped off the porch. But as soon as he came back inside it started again. This continued until sunrise. On the last night we decided to stay awake and watch from the window. At exactly 2 a.m. a tall, shadowy figure appeared from the tree line and stood at the edge of the forest watching the cabin. It never came closer, but we felt its eyes on us the entire night. We left early the next morning and never spoke of that weekend again. The man with no face. During my summer job as a delivery driver, I often had to make late-night deliveries to rural areas. One night I got an order to a small cottage deep in the woods. The road was narrow and unlit, and the air felt heavy as if something was watching me. When I arrived, the house was dark except for a dim light coming from the front porch. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. As I turned to leave, I noticed a man standing at the edge of the driveway. He was wearing old clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. But as he stepped closer, I realized he had no face at all. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. I dropped the package and rushed back to my car. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road watching me as I sped away. 4 days after that encounter, I kept seeing glimpses of him in reflections. In shop windows, in car mirrors, even in puddles. He would just stand silently and vanish the moment I looked directly at him. I quit that job soon after. I never went near that area again. The night at the abandoned hospital. One summer night my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for decades and was rumored to be haunted. We entered through a broken side door and were immediately greeted by the smell of mold and decay. As we explored the dark hallways, we heard faint whispers echoing through the building. At first we thought it was just the wind, but the whispers formed words. They were calling our names. One by one. When we reached the surgical wing, we found an old gurney in the middle of the room with rusty restraints. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut. Our flashlights flickered and the temperature dropped. We heard footsteps circling us but saw no one. Then the whispers turned into screams. Loud agonizing screams that filled the entire floor. We ran towards the exit, but the hall seemed endless, as if the building was shifting. Finally we found a window and smashed it open to escape. When we looked back, the hospital stood silent as if nothing had happened. Later we learned that a fire had killed several patients and staff in that wing decades ago. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the last time we ever went urban exploring. The lantern in the graveyard. Last summer my cousin and I decided to visit the old graveyard at the edge of our town. It was a dare, and we were foolish enough to accept. The graveyard was known for strange lights appearing late at night. We arrived around midnight with nothing but our phone flashlights. At first everything was still and quiet. But then we saw a small lantern light moving slowly between the tombstones. We thought it was a caretaker until we realized there was no one holding it. The light floated gracefully, weaving through the graves. Suddenly the air became cold and we heard whispers all around us. Voices calling our names. The lantern light moved closer and we could now see a faint figure beneath it. A shadowy shape with hollow eyes staring directly at us. We turned and ran as fast as we could. But no matter how far we ran, the light seemed to follow. Only when we reached the graveyard gate did it stop and vanish. The next day my cousin found deep scratch marks on his car as if something had clawed it. We never went back to that graveyard again. The face behind the curtain. I was house-sitting for my aunt one summer when she went out of town. The house was big with large windows and thin curtains. One night as I was watching TV, I felt like I was being watched. I glanced at the window and saw a face peeking through the curtain. It was pale with sunken eyes and an unnaturally wide smile. I jumped up and ran to the window, but there was no one outside. Moments later I heard soft tapping on the glass as if fingernails were scratching it. Every time I looked, the face would disappear, but the tapping never stopped. I closed all the curtains and stayed up the entire night with every light on. The next morning I found small handprints on the outside of every window. They were too small to be an adult's but larger than a child's. I never told my aunt what happened. But I never agreed to house sit for her again. The Watcher on the balcony. Last summer I rented a small apartment on the top floor of an old building. The apartment had a small balcony that overlooked the street. One night as I was sitting outside, I noticed a man standing on the rooftop of the building across from me. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he never moved. He just stood there staring directly at me. At first I thought it was strange, but I ignored it. However, every night after that he was there in the exact same spot. No matter what time I went out, he was already there watching. One night I decided to call out to him, but he didn't respond. I even waved, but he remained completely still. Suddenly he lifted his arm and pointed directly at me. At that moment every light in my apartment flickered. When I looked back at the rooftop, he was gone. I never saw him leave. From that night onwards, strange things began happening in my apartment. Objects moved on their own. I would hear footsteps on the balcony at night, but when I checked, no one was there. I moved out by the end of summer. I still don't know who that man was or why he was watching me. The Whispering Lake. Last summer my friends and I decided to camp near a secluded lake deep in the forest. Locals had told stories about strange whispers heard around the water at night. We set up our tents and built a fire. Everything was fine until midnight, when the air suddenly became very still. No wind, no sounds of insects. Then we heard it. Soft whispers floating over the surface of the lake. At first we thought it was someone playing a prank, but the whispers grew louder and began to echo all around us. They were not in any language we could understand. We shined our flashlights towards the lake and saw ripples moving in strange patterns. Suddenly a dark silhouette emerged from the water, standing unnaturally still in the shallow part of the lake. It had no face, just a smooth surface where features should have been. We grabbed our gear and ran back to the car. As we drove away, we could still hear the whispers in the wind. We never spoke of that night again. The hallway light. During my summer break, I was staying at my grandmother's old house. It was a small place with narrow hallways and creaky wooden floors. One night I was lying in bed when I noticed the hallway light turn on by itself. I assumed my grandmother had woken up, but when I called out, she did not respond. The light turned off. Then a few seconds later it turned back on. This kept happening in a rhythm. On-off pause, on-off pause. Suddenly I heard soft footsteps approaching my bedroom door. The light flickered violently and the footsteps stopped right outside my room. I held my breath as the doorknob slowly twisted, but the door did not open. After a few minutes everything went silent. The next morning I asked my grandmother if she had been up that night. She said she never left her room and that the hallway light had not worked for years. I never slept in that house again. The staircase stranger. I used to work part-time at an old library during the summer. The building had a narrow staircase leading to a rarely used basement archive. One evening as I was locking up, I heard footsteps coming from the basement stairs. I called out thinking someone was still inside but got no response. The footsteps grew louder as if someone was slowly climbing up the stairs. I waited at the top but no one appeared. Yet the sound of footsteps was right beneath me. Curious and a bit scared, I leaned over the stairwell to see who it was. What I saw made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure was crawling up the wall alongside the staircase. Its movements were unnatural, jerking and twisted. I slammed the basement door shut and ran out of the library. The next day I refused to go back to work. Later I found out that a former librarian had died after falling down those very stairs decades ago. Some say she still roams the basement searching for her lost books.